Good morning. Good to see all of you here today. We're going to be in James chapter 1. James chapter 1. If you want to go ahead and turn there, you may. I'm also going to be reading from Matthew chapter 7. So if you want to turn there, you can have both of those places. James chapter 1 and Matthew chapter 7. I'll start with James chapter 1, beginning in verse 22. Do not merely listen to the word, and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word, but does not do what it says, is like a man who looks at his face in a mirror, and after looking at himself, goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But the man who looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues to do this, not forgetting what he has heard, but doing it, he will be blessed in what he does. And then Jesus says something quite similar over in Matthew chapter 7, beginning in verse 24. Matthew chapter 7, beginning in verse 24. Now, most of you who grew up in the church, you probably are going to be tempted to sing this text as I am reading it. So here we go. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. I'll begin with a question. Now, admittedly, you're going to have to reveal your age, but only indirectly. Okay, so I'm not going to ask the year you were born or how old you are. I know I'm not supposed to do that. But I'll ask the question. How many of you have been listening to sermons for 50 years or more? Raise your hand. Okay, keep them up. I want you to look around. Keep them up. Keep them up. Now look around here. All right, keep them up. 40 years or more. 50 years or more, keep them up. 40 years or more. Okay, man, you guys are really revealing some things here. 30 years or more. Okay, 20 years or more. 15 years or more. 10 years or more. All right, now look around. Okay, you can put your hands down. Have you stopped to think about how many sermons that is that you have heard? That's a lot of sermons. Let's just assume for a moment, if you've been listening to sermons for 50 years or more, and let's say an average of 40 sermons, that's actually a low average, because if you're like me, I grew up going to church every Sunday morning, every Sunday night, every Wednesday night, and most of what I heard there was kind of sermon-like. And then, we would have the revival sermon, where somebody would come in twice a year and they would preach, the equivalent of 3 sermons in one. And, we would, have the going down the aisle and the singing of Just As I Am, 16 verses of it and so on. So most of us who have grown up in that environment have heard more than 40 sermons a year. Now, do the math. Let's just assume 40 sermons, 50 years. How many sermons is that? It's 2,000 sermons. 2,000. Am I getting the math right? Somebody, all right. I think I'm getting the math right. Okay, all right. I need a math teacher to help me on that. There we go. That's right. 2,000 sermons. Actually, it's more than that, really, right? Now, the first time I calculated that, I'm 65. I've been preaching since I was 17 regularly. So I began to ask, how many sermons have I preached? I mean, you would think after a while I learn how to do it. But you think how many sermons you've listened to. And in the churches of Christ, we are known especially for having very strong expectations as to what the preacher does in the sermon. Now, every preacher, how many of you in here have preached? Okay, several of you in here have preached. Okay, you have felt, I'm sure, this metaphoric trap door underneath you. Okay, trap door, where every member of the audience has a finger that they can press the button and poof, there you are. Kind of like the dunking booth. You know, not quite that, but it feels like it. It's really not that bad, but you sometimes feel it. Each of us has enough insecurity about us that, you know, we look at our audiences and we see whether they're identifying with us. And if they are, we feel good. If they don't, we feel a little uncertain about what we're doing. And we have to work beyond that, but still there's some of it. And there has been some research that when you compare the churches of Christ to some other evangelical groups, that we have a little higher expectation of what happens in the pulpit from Sunday to Sunday. We really do expect the preacher to have a strong, should I say it? I want to be careful with the word, strong performance. You know, that's where the preacher shines, is in the delivery of the sermon. So the more sermons we've heard and the more we're part of this particular fellowship that is a part of a long tradition, we have very strong expectations of sermons. And it can get to where, in listening to the sermons, we develop habits about what we appropriate from them. Now, the text that I read from James chapter 1, it focuses on hearing the word. Now, we could say that everything he says about hearing the word also applies that if you're reading it. So, yes, we can say that. Anytime you're encountering the word, there's something James says needs to be remembered every time. And that is that not only do you need to hear it or to receive it in whatever way you're getting it, not only do you need to hear it, but you need to what? Do it, right? And he compares it to looking at the word, encountering the word, and it's like you're looking at your face in a mirror and you walk away from the mirror and you forget immediately what you've seen. And that's like hearing and not doing. But then he says, if you look intently into the word for the purpose of not only hearing it but doing it, you'll be blessed in your affairs, in your walk with the Lord. The blessing will come there. And the idea of intently, I want you to imagine the difference between looking at a mirror and just kind of seeing if everything's in place versus looking at a mirror and realizing there's something you want to take care of. You know, there's some kind of little trim you want to do, or you miss this or miss that. You'd want to adjust the cosmetology so that you have just the look that you want to have. That's looking intently. So it's kind of like you're seeing and doing. You're actually doing something about what you see. That's this notion of looking intently into the perfect law, as James describes there. But then Jesus uses a different analogy. He comes to the end of what we call the Sermon on the Mount, which those teachings were probably delivered in several settings over different places and different times. I am under the impression that Matthew is recording something that was delivered all at once. And he gets to the end of it, and he uses this analogy of the wise man building the house on the rock or the foolish man building the house on the sand. And he says, if you hear my words and you do them, you're like the person who builds the house on the rock, which essentially means a solid foundation. That you are essentially foundationing your life correctly if you hear it and do it. And so he says it's like a house that's built on a rock, that when the rains come and the streams rise and the floods come and the winds beat against the house, it'll stand because it has a good foundation. But if you hear these words and you don't do them, it's like your house being built on sand, a poor foundation. Doesn't have a lot of leverage, not a lot of clearance. So when the rains come and the streams rise, the floods come up, and the winds come and beat on the house, it falls with a great crash, which I think Jesus is saying there, that sometimes when we hear and don't do over a long period of time, there can be at times a kind of cataclysmic event that reveals the reality of what we are spiritually or not. It may not be cataclysmic, it may just be a crisis. And some of you may have experienced that you thought things were going fairly well spiritually, and then a faith crisis of some kind comes to you, and you realize that what you thought you had, you may not have had, and it sort of, punches you in the gut. I've experienced that, where I thought my faith was real strong in a given area, or at least there was a virtue that I thought, well, I think I've got a handle on that. And then something happens that just challenges it like crazy, and I realized the foundation wasn't quite there. Now, so both James and Jesus tell us it is important to both hear and do. And they illustrate it in different ways. But then James adds a little piece to this when he says, do not be hearers, not merely listen to the word, and so, you see the word, deceive yourselves. So, what's deception? Deception is when you think this is the case, but in reality, this is the case. You're deceived. For some reason, you cannot see the truth of the matter. And when he says that, it's like we can be hearing the word and think something is happening when it's not. We can hear the word over and over again, perhaps, for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, I'm looking around, 60 years or more. I won't go any higher than that. 60 years or more on a regular basis, and keep on hearing it and keep on hearing it and keep on hearing it, and think something is happening when it's not, in the way that we perhaps believe it is. Because you see, the more we hear, especially in our culture, we are accustomed to fine speaking. Religiously, we are. And that has especially become the case in the age of YouTube or streaming. And particularly in 2020 and beyond, we really began to experience a kind of church connoisseurship of sermons. I'm reminded every time I preach, it's not like somebody tells me every time, but I do realize that if you listen to me from Sunday to Sunday, and listen to any preacher, I just happen to be the one standing in front of you, so I'll speak of it in personal terms. If you listen to me Sunday after Sunday, I have no doubt in my mind, all you would have to do is go to the Facebook page of a church that has a better preacher, and you can hear a much better sermon than I have delivered. And you can participate vicariously in that worship experience from that church. I'm not naive. How many sermon podcasts are there? I mean, I can tell you I listen to 10 on a fairly regular basis. Not like I listen to 10 sermons a week. Please don't get me wrong on that. I'm not that odd, okay? I'm a bit odd, but not that odd. But I have a series of 10 or so sermon podcasts that I listen to on a rotating basis. And I will tell you, they all preach better than I do. And better than any preacher in my personal acquaintance. They're just really, really good. And I wonder how they got that good. And I rationalized, well, they got research teams doing their research for them, just putting a sermon in front of them on Thursday, and then they just kind of go through it. Or I bet they got AI doing that sermon for them. They're doing that sermon with a word bot. Well, by the way, don't be surprised if that's happening. AI can be an actually very helpful enterprise in sermon preparation. Not that I have any experience with that, but I know some people who do. I know a guy, okay? We become such special consumers of preaching and can engage in the experience. And it's not just the preaching. It can be the Sunday school class or something else that we're participating in. And we can engage some of them in such a way, James is telling us, to where we can be deceived. And it's a kind of subtle deception. Let me mention a few ways that if we're not careful, we can hear and be deceived into thinking something is occurring when it may not be. Let me just mention a few of them. One is when we listen more critically than appreciatively. We listen more critically than appreciatively. Now, don't misunderstand. Last thing I'm encouraging you to do is to listen to my sermons or anyone else's. Again, I'm just using myself because I happen to be the one standing before you today. I'm not saying listen to something and don't carefully appropriate what's being said to make sure that what's being said is true. All of that is good. Within my own background, I remember hearing many times about the Bereans over in Acts chapter 17 who listened and tested about what they heard. And that's a good thing. But there does come a point where after we're part of a church family for a while, we have to get to the point to where we trust that what we're going to hear is of value. And we make that assumption. We enter into it much more appreciatively than critically. I don't know any preacher who hits a home run every Sunday. I don't. Well, I take that back. I know a few, but they're in that 0.001 percentage point of all the preachers out there. Most of us who preach, those of you who have any experience with this, and those of you who are even listening to them, you realize that if you listen to these kinds of presentations fundamentally for the purpose of evaluating what you hear, and it's so hard to withhold that, isn't it? It's really hard to withhold that. If we listen to it fundamentally with that in mind, we usually walk away with a very small appropriation of what was said. There's just not much we're taking away from it. If, on the other hand, we're able to listen to it and say, I wonder what I can find here that is useful and helpful and good and will contribute to my growth as a believer in Christ, you can find something all the time. I mean, I say that. It'd be really, really rare that you couldn't. I've told you a little bit of my own story, that there was a point at which I became a member of the church where I used to be the preacher. And I'm not necessarily recommending it, although some of you may be sitting in here today who are in that situation. It was a difficult time for me, but I'll tell you one of the most difficult things. No one listens to sermons more critically than other preachers. I think they just do. And here I was sitting in that pew. And it was kind of a Saul has slain his thousands and David has slain his 10,000s a little bit. I mean, I was feeling a little bit. Nobody was ever communicating that to me, but I felt it. And as I was sitting there listening, I was thinking, he could have said that better. That sentence could have been constructed more accurately. He kind of murdered the King's English on that one. No, that didn't happen right. I was trying to see the comma in that, and he didn't communicate the comma very well. Or, now wait a minute. That's not as theologically adept an observation as it needs to be. It's kind of a little shallow statement. He should have nuanced that a little bit better. Now, I never came out and said that. If I'd said that, my wife would have been doing this, to me the whole time, because I would have thought I was muttering it under my breath and no one heard it, but in reality, probably people would have heard it. But I remember what it felt like to be sitting there listening to somebody else preach. And I thought, I had to change. I really had to shift. And I had to understand that I was no different in that place than any other person who had been sitting and listening to me in that same place over the years. And I had to start listening much more appreciatively than critically. Because sometimes we can listen critically, criticizing what we've heard. And I don't mean criticizing in terms of yapping about it. I'm talking about you've really tried to critically assess everything that's going on. You walk away doing that thinking, okay, I've done what I need to do. James is saying, nope. No, when you're hearing the word transcends the communicator. The word transcends the person who is delivering it. And the word is more important than the package in which it comes. How many of you have ever received a Christmas gift that was wrapped by someone who had no idea what they were doing when they were wrapping it? I don't wrap anymore. I just get those pretty bags with the tissue paper, whatever they call that, and just kind of stuff it in there, because I'm terrible at wrapping. I'm bad at it. It looks terrible. I mean, it just doesn't look good. But what's inside that box is a whole lot more important than the wrapping. And we know that. We know that intrinsically. And that's part of the reason why we don't pay a lot of attention to the wrapper. Because what's inside transcends the importance of the package. And that's true for most sermons that we hear. And there's usually so much value there for us to be able to get to that. We can listen more critically than appreciatively, sometimes thinking that something has happened when it hasn't. But then there's another. We can listen for style over substance. Style over substance. Every preacher has a style, and every church has a preferred style. They just do. Churches have personalities, preachers have personalities. There's some preachers, here, especially here in Nashville. Have you ever noticed here in Nashville we have a bunch of academic style preachers? There's a whole lot of people who just have that sort of academic flair. It's because we've got Lipscomb University right here with Bible professors and people who are trained. Here in Nashville, I haven't stood up in front of one church to preach where there weren't at least 15 people who could preach it just as well as I could preach it. That's that way here. I suspect there are a whole lot of you who could say what I'm saying and maybe say it better. And we all have a style. We all have a way of doing it. Some are, more emotional by nature, and they'll convey that emotion and that passion and that feeling in what they're doing, and it's all good because the feelers out there, I'm thinking of the Myers-Briggs types here, the feelers here, the intuitive feelers just say, oh, wow, this is good. The Holy Spirit is really working through His lesson. I just know it. I feel it. I feel it. I feel it in my feet. I feel it in my bones. This is wonderful. You just really touched my heart. And then there are others that try as much as they can to touch the heart and get to the emotion of things. They just don't know how to get there because it's very intellectual. It's getting into the depth and the meat of the word, and that's important. Here's the reality: there's not a right or wrong there. They're all good. They're all helpful in their own way and in their own time. But especially in our culture, ever since we have, really it was long before this, but I think it got accentuated when we started evaluating presidential candidates by their television presentation, and then just one thing after another, and we began to receive all of our public leaders through their capacity with style. And listen to the way that our candidates these days are critiqued. It's who got the best shot, who got the best zinger at the time. And then, oh wow, with so many ways that we can listen to preaching today, you really can literally choose your poison. You can. You can just choose whatever. You can choose your best style. Choose your best one. Is there anything wrong with style? No, nothing wrong with it. In fact, it's a natural flow from one personality to a group of people. But Paul addresses this. Over in 1 Corinthians, he addresses it pretty strongly. Right at the beginning when he says, some of you are of Paul, some of you are of Cephas, some of you are of Apollos. And what he's doing there is he's saying, look, you guys are dividing according to rhetorical style. And that's really what was happening. And he says over in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, when you do that, you are carnal and not spiritual. That's true during that time. If you were raising your boy right, you sent him off to learn rhetoric. I mean, it was a prized discipline in the culture at the time. And sometimes rhetoricians made their living by patrons who would literally support them through all their lives. And it seems as if that's part of the difficulty in Corinth. You remember over in Corinth, those of you who've read the 1 Corinthians correspondence, in 1 Corinthians 9, he talks about he didn't want to receive money from them because they weren't quite mature enough. He's talking about patronage there. The idea is that if you patronized a rhetorician, you had expectations that they would sort of fulfill your design. And Paul said, no, we're not going to have that kind of relationship because I know how you have a tendency to put the pressure on. And he says, you guys have got to get beyond this to where you realize that each one of those persons you're tending to line up under, they're just servants. And you don't need to judge another man's servant. I mean, he's pretty strong on that. So he said, it's not Paul, it's not Apollos, it's not Cephas, it's Jesus. It's Christ and him crucified and making sure that Christ is preached. But we can walk away, I know this, we can walk away from a sermon and we can evaluate whether the style was exactly the way we wanted, and we can think we've done something with the sermon, when in reality we haven't. We haven't. There's another way that we can sort of deceive ourselves when it comes to this, and that's to listen more for the shallows than for the depth. Listen for the shallows than for the depth. How many of you like to swim in the ocean? Okay. I don't. And I may be the one with the problem, but I have psychological categories for people who love to swim in the ocean. I've just revealed I am the one with the problem, right? I just like to be able to see the bottom of wherever I'm swimming. And if I get out there in a foot of water and I can't see the bottom, I'm thinking, I'm not supposed to be in here. Especially when I feel some kind of current swirling around in there and I feel something bump my foot. I mean, it maybe a milk carton, but I'm thinking, shark, and I'm wanting to run, rip current, whatever. I just don't, maybe I've got leftover visions of what it was like when I was a little kid one time, got swept by a wave and just was under the water, twirling around. My dad had to reach and grab me and pull me out, and I was just spewing water all over the place. Maybe I've never gotten that out of my head. But most of us can enjoy the shallows. The depths require more skill. Just like when you need more skill to handle the depths of water, sometimes you need a little more skill to handle the depth of truth. Over in Hebrews, the Hebrews writer was really strong on this. He got onto them over in Hebrews 4 when he said, you guys are at the point where you ought to be teachers, but you're still in that spot that I can only give you the milk of the word. And he said, I'm wanting to talk to you about a very important piece. In fact, he's wanting to get into teaching about the high priestly order of Melchizedek and how Jesus is a part of that high priestly order. But he says, you're not ready. You're really not capable of receiving it, so I can't give it to you. And he says, you're like people who should be taking in meat, but you can't. You're not ready for that. And sometimes we have this thing about preaching and teaching of the word where we say, I don't want them to go too deep. I don't want them to go too far. I want them to just kind of stay there. But here's the reality. The reality is that in our working worlds, in our professions, we sometimes are willing to deal with things that are extremely challenging and that really push us intellectually. But sometimes we have this unwritten rule that when it comes to church, we don't want someone to challenge us in quite the same way and to take us where we need to go. And we can be deceived into thinking something has happened when it hasn't. Another way that this can happen is when we listen for conviction versus consecration. Conviction versus consecration. Listening with that in mind can feel like this. It's, well, you know, the preacher didn't really stir me up the way he should. It didn't prick my heart. It didn't quite get me to where I feel motivated to do something about it. And it's his responsibility to motivate me, to get me there. It's his responsibility to move me to that point to where I'm actually willing to act upon it. And he didn't hit the mark, and so here I go. That's conviction without consecration. But consecration says, I'm devoting my life to the Lord, and the word has been placed before me. And if the word has been placed before me, I have an obligation. I have a responsibility before that word. And that responsibility overrides anything I may have felt in the experience of taking it in. I need the nourishment more than I need the taste. And then that nourishment, I gather something. Well, then how is it that we become both hearers and doers? Let me mention one thing. We become more doers than simply hearers when we reverse the self-deception. Just reverse the self-deception. That we listen appreciatively more than critically. We listen for the substance over the style. We listen with a hunger for depth over the shallow. We listen with consecration in mind, not merely conviction. We listen for transformation, not just information. James says, do not be merely hearers of the word, but be doers. Don't deceive yourselves. And then Jesus says, if you hear these words of mine and you do them, it's like building your house on a rock. And the rains come and the streams rise and the floods come and the winds beat on the house and it'll stand. But on the other hand, if you hear these words and you don't do them, then it's like building your house on the sand. And the rains will fall, and the streams will rise, and the floods will come, and the winds will beat on the house, and it will fall with a great crash, he says. So let's be doers of the word, and not hearers only. We're going to stand to sing a song. We do this for a good purpose every Sunday. And part of the purpose is to give people an opportunity to respond in whatever way they feel is appropriate. For most of us, it's standing with the assembly, and we're thinking about something as simple as the question, what difference does all this make? What difference should it make? Not just what's been said in the sermon, but everything that's happened in the assembly that has in some way or another reminded us of life with the Lord. And whatever needs might be there. Let's stand and sing.